Thank you. This is truly overwhelming, and it makes me a little bit nervous because there's a lot more expertise in the room than there is in the book itself. So I'm just going to try to highlight some of the stories that I came to hear over the last few years working on this project. I really would like to thank the Historical Society for both the opportunity to present today, but especially for the opportunity to create this book and to have so much support in creating a book that was so rich in images that help tell this story. So some of my earlier work has been, I started looking at Butte and the relationship to Anaconda Company mines in Chile several years ago with an interest in women's lives and women's stories. And then that led me to a collaborative project about women and community building in Butte in the 20th century. And all along, through my work as a social worker and a social work educator, I thought a lot and taught about children and youth, but for some reason I'd never put the two together of thinking about children and childhood in Butte until about 4 or 5 years ago when the first seeds of ideas for this project came about. So this is a project dear to my heart, having grown up in Butte, and children are really at the heart of this story. So what the book was about really was trying to look at two questions. What could we learn about Butte through the eyes of children? And what could Butte, as a site of industrialization at the turn of the last century, maybe teach us about children and childhood? So those were my two guiding questions. Can people hear me okay? Is that working all right? Thanks. So what I want to do is share a few of the highlights of that history of Butte as seen through a child's eye view. I want to talk a little bit about what I learned from children's perspectives on culture and neighborhood and community, how children talk about work and school and play, and then just a few of the lessons that I took away from this project. And I'm delighted that some of the people I had the opportunity to interview are in the audience today, so I hope I do justice to their stories as well. So most of you don't need much of an introduction to Butte, but I'll give a little bit anyway. If we look at Butte at the turn of the last century, its population was at 62,000. Its mining workforce was 12,000 strong, and it was producing over 1/3 of the nation's copper at that time. It had an immigrant workforce that was growing year by year, first Cornish and Irish, followed by Italians, Finns, Swedes, Croatians, Montenegrins, Syrians, Lebanese, and the list goes on. New arrivals were gravitating toward the neighborhoods they were building and creating very tight-knit communities in the process. So the bonds that were built underground were equally strong above ground. People needed that sense of community. Thank you. And they needed the strength of those family ties because, as we know, mining was notoriously dangerous work. It was often said that miners might not live past 40. The toll of accidents were daily reported. And then the slower death by miners' consumption took a toll on so many families. I'm going to move up here to an image here of the Leonard mine. Just as an example of the toll that mining took on families is the 1913 accident in the Leonard mine that resulted in the deaths of 5 men who were fathers of young children. There was, to me, a really touching account in the Butte Miner that offered some poignant details of what that accident meant in terms of families. I quote, "Nicholas Treglone had been in Butte a comparatively short time. He is survived by his wife and 3-year-old daughter. When news of the accident reached the Treglone home, the little girl was playing just outside the door. Realization of its import did not come to her. She played about the house all afternoon, noting her mother's tears with wonderment. And when she saw the men coming off shift from the other mines, she called repeatedly, 'Daddy, where's my daddy?' There's something about that line that I can hardly get through, having read it so many times, that it touches me about how children experienced the dangers of mining in their own ways. That dangerous work in the mines produced many widows and left many families in harsh circumstances. Women and children worked hard and relied on the support of neighbors to get by. Ailey Goldberg, she came to Butte as just a young child. Her father died in the mines in Michigan, and her mother brought her young children to Butte to get a job in a boarding house as a way to support her children. They moved to Finntown, and her mother first worked at the Clarence and then later at the Belmont boarding house. Ailey remembered in her oral history recorded in the late 1970s that she would go to the neighbor's house to get her hair braided before she would go off to school in the morning because her mother would already be at work. She said, "Mom cooked all the time, and wherever Mother worked, why, that's where we'd have our meals, because that's one thing. She wanted to make sure we had a hot meal, being that she was gone all day. We ate at the boarding house. It was family style. Your noon meal, it was potatoes and stew, and sometimes there'd be fried meat at noon. Us kids, we never ate at the table with the men. There was a little table on the side, and that's where we'd sit. I liked the atmosphere of a boarding house. The men were very generous. On payday, it was always a quarter, maybe 50 cents. Come the holidays, they'd maybe get a little package for you." Some women and children had to turn to the state or the county poor fund to get by. One of the pieces of data I found were the handwritten notes of the county poor fund investigators in Butte. And so these terse entry really describe the difficult conditions of many people's lives in the early 1900s. This one reading, Mrs. P.D., age 44, husband died 1 year ago, left no money, no insurance, 5 children. Oldest girl, 19, married, cannot help them. One 16, 15, 10, and 6. Boy of 16, delicate, not able to work or go to school. They own a little 3-room shack. She herself works when she can get it. Cannot go out to work as the 6-year-old is sick. Seems to be a deserving case. She got relations but gets no help from them. So in these terse moments, we see a lot of decisions being made about who might be deserving of a $10 voucher for the month, who might be deserving of coal to get the family through a cold winter month. Butte also captured the attention of a lot of early reformers, first charity organizations and later through the state of Montana. W.A. Clark himself, you see down here, really, we think of him as the great copper king, and he had a really soft spot in his heart for children as well. His own son, Paul, died at age 16 of sudden illness, and W.A. Clark then turned over some of his own resources to the construction of the Paul Clark Home for Children. And he turned over the day-to-day operations of the home to the Associated Charities of Butte. The home was quite a nice facility, but you see in the records of the Associated Charities a lot of judgments being made about the children, of whether they were worthy of assistance or what were they going to be at risk, were they going to go wayward. The children were known as inmates. And here's a quote from the Associated Charities annual report. "We must recognize that the most hopeful work that can be done in saving children from is saving them from beggary and vice. They must be taught to feel the responsibility their parents never felt, taught, if possible, the skills their parents never learned, given the character their parents never had." So when you think of how hard people are working with these hardscrabble lives, and then these are some of the judgments being passed on to their children. One of my favorite accounts from the Paul Clark home is little Eddie Bennett. And W.A. Clark funded for all the kids at the Paul Clark home to go and have Children's Day at Columbia Gardens. And this was August of 1905. And somehow little Eddie gets left behind when the trolley goes back to the Paul Clark home. So in the late hours of the evening, little Eddie starts walking from Columbia Gardens, Butte's sort of beautiful amusement park that was quite a ways out of town, and he walks through town, through the center of town, and is at the corner of Park and Excelsior, almost back to the Paul Clark home, when he's picked up by the police. And the news accounts quotes that he manfully held back tears as he said to the officer, "Well, I looked at my situation and I figured the only thing I could do was walk." walk. And little Eddie Bennett was 5 at the time. And you know, the story to me, it's here's little Eddie Bennett, who's pretty darn streetwise and pretty resilient and pretty savvy, sort of the very skills that it seems that the ladies of the Associated Charities were sort of frowning upon, but it's what got little Eddie Bennett home that day. So little Eddie Bennett has a special place in my heart. By about 1903, the state of Montana has developed, sort of with the wave of the progressive era across the country, they've formed the Bureau of Child and Animal Protection. And the early child protection legislation all came out of, we had laws for animal cruelty, but we didn't really have anything to protect children. So it was, the first director of the Bureau was Otto Schoenfeld. And in his first annual report in 1904, he worried a lot to the legislature about the state and status of children, and especially children in Butte, because here was this big industrial center, and I think poor Otto must have lost a lot of sleep just trying to worry and constantly think about how he's going to take care of the children from Butte. And one of the things that he really worried about in terms of children in Butte was the practice of rushing the can, and that's where children would be sent by their dads down to the local saloon with a bucket. It might be their miner's bucket, it might be a lard bucket, to get it filled up with beer and rush it back home for their parents. And Otto Schoenfeld thought that was just, you know, pretty much, it was just like, that was the road to ruin, letting your children rush the can. Here's a little girl from Blaine School, Marguerite McDonald, who was a teacher in Butte, saved a lot of her children's essays. And so this is one of the essays from the Blaine School. My father is a miner and a very cranky man. He drinks quite a bit of liquor and he likes to rush the can. His hair is red, his eyes are blue, he wears a 44 vest. He is a darling daddy and his name is Richard Best. So that was all the spelling as is in the original. Judge Michael Donlin in Butte was sort of the grandfather of juvenile justice in Butte, and he variably cajoled and disciplined and pleaded and nurtured the various children that came across his path. And they might be there. A lot of kids were sent before the juvenile justice system for truancy, and it turns out a lot of them were really trying to juggle work responsibilities at home with going to school. And so parents might be pleading the case of how they really needed their kids' labor, that they couldn't have them in school all day long. So Judge Donlin heard a lot of truancy cases, but every once in a while he had an interesting one, like the 4 little arsonists who visited Columbia Gardens on Easter Sunday of 1907. So they had, the Gardens was closed for the season, it was kind of a windy day. They got under the grandstand because they had some contraband cigarettes and some matches. So they get under there to light their cigarettes, and there's a big bird's nest that's fallen, and they just can't help themselves. So they strike the match, and they light the bird's nest on fire. So the bird's nest goes up in flames, and the whole grandstand goes up in flames. And these 4 little stunned arsonists are just running for home, and they get picked up by Columbia Gardens security. So they're later all before Judge Donlin, and 3 out of 4 of them just tearfully confess, and they're all apologetic. One of them says, "I simply wanted to see the effect that he'd had on the nest." The 4th one, he was adamant. He just crossed his arms and looked at the judge and said, "Judge, I had nothing to do with it. I quit smoking 2 years ago." So. People really got through both good and hard times in Butte by building really strong neighborhoods and communities, and their neighborhoods really became extended families in many ways. Children grew up with a strong sense of social and cultural identity that were honed in these tight-knit neighborhoods. For example, Ann Pentella grew up in the Boulevard area off of South Montana Street, home to many Southern European immigrants, particularly Croatians, such as her parents. She said, like many in the neighborhood, her parents relied on a big vegetable garden to help the family get by. They had a smokehouse and a root cellar where they put away provisions for winter. She said in wintertime, Dad used to get us all set. We used to buy maybe 20 sacks of spuds, and then he'd make his own sauerkraut. There'd be about 2 or 3 50-gallon barrels. Sometimes we'd raise a pig and cure it and smoke it. Dad used to go down to the Metropolitan Market and buy a whole hog for about $15. He'd cut it in pieces and soak it in brine. Then we'd hang the meat on hooks on the clothesline to have it dried. Then he'd smoke it. That'd be our food for the winter. Then he'd make sauerkraut. We had a basement that was all dirt and it was damp down there. We used to have to stamp down the sauerkraut in barrels with our feet. Stamp it till all the juice came out. It'd have to be solid. If not, it would get mushy and spoil. But if we did it right, it would keep all winter. Marie Butori grew up in Meaderville. She said the Italians lived in Meaderville and everybody knew you and you knew everybody. They were the Guidi brothers and they were really Italian. They had this salcina. It was some kind of fish. They'd salt it and spread it out. You could only get it from them. It was just in the shape of a fish and it was really hard. My mom used to boil it. It was really good. Then they made this thick, thick blood sausage. It had raisins and stuff in it. It was just as big as that, and oh, it was delicious. They had everything, real Italian olives, the big ones, the kind that are all shriveled, that taste really good. There were 2 brothers, Dominic and Alfredo. Alfredo used to come around and get the orders. So he was at our house every Saturday. He was part of the family. Tom Halter, this is Tom as a youngster, his grandfather and uncle ran Cibatari's market and grocery in Meaderville. That's where he worked as a boy. One of the perks of the job for him was going to get to pick up bread deliveries from the Sconfienza bakery. And he said he'd always time it when Mr. Sconfienza was gone and Mrs. Sconfienza was there because she'd give him like a little piece of cheese and his own little bite of salami and a breadstick. And then he also remembered the Guidi brothers. And he said, Guidi brothers, sausage and salami. He said, for the longest time, when I was a little kid, they had Guidi brothers, sausage and salami. I thought that was their names, sausage and salami. This is Lucille Martinez O'Sheehan, the blonde, and her friend Columbina Fontana. Lucille was also a Meaderville girl. Her parents immigrated from Italy in about 1906, and her father went to work in the mines. Her dad used to make wine each fall. Her story is similar to many stories I recorded, and he'd store it in the dirt cellar. She said she grew up with wine as a part of her mealtime. She always preferred a little glass of wine and water with her meal rather than milk as a child. Her parents were very avid gardeners, maintained a small subsistence farm at the family home, and her mother was a great cook. Her dad died from miner's consumption when he was 50, and so her mother used her culinary skills to support the family. And she said many women in Meaderville would cook these elaborate Italian dinners in their homes, and people would then pay to come in and eat in the home and have it be a catered dinner in their home. John Mazzola he was in one of the few Italian families that were part of Butte's East Side. His grandmother lived next door to him, and he recalled both his grandmother and mother being very musically talented, and they always had musical instruments in their homes. He said he remembered having a violin, a banjo, a guitar, and he said in something they called a xylophone. When all the other neighborhood kids were out playing marbles and having fun on Saturdays, John would go to his grandmother's house where she expected him to come and listen to opera with her. He was the youngest of the boys, so it was his job to wind the Victrola. He said, and then she'd go through the mutato, they called it in Italian, the pantomime. And we'd listen to opera, and she'd make some kind of little cookies and serve tea. And then when I went in the Army in 1943, the big cities, they'd all have opera. And we'd go to town, and the GIs could go for free. I'd take my buddies with me, and I did all the interpreting. I'd sit there and tell them all about the opera. I used to hate it, but I loved it then. Butte's large Irish community dominated much of the Butte Hill. Dublin Gulch, Corktown, the Hungry Hill comprised tight Irish Catholic neighborhoods where children grew up steeped in Irish culture, politics, and history. St. Mary's Parish, established in 1913, was a centerpiece of the Irish community. On Sunday mornings, the vestibule would be filled with miners' lunch buckets. St. Mary's Church offered Gaelic language classes and Irish history classes. Children got their political education early on as they lined up to welcome Eamon de Valera and other fighters for the cause of Irish independence on their many visits to Butte. John Skeff Sheehy grew up in the embrace of an Irish immigrant family and community. He said, we lived about a block from the original mine, about 2 blocks from the Stewart mine, to the west about a quarter of a mile from the Anselmo. My mother and father both came from Ireland. My father came from County Kerry and my mother from County Cork. They met in Butte, where my father was a miner and my mother, I think, a bucket girl. My earliest memories are of my father and mother going back and forth among the Irish families, visiting each other, and mostly talking about the old country. At our house at night, it was a great gathering place for women, Irish women. They'd come in their shawls. They all wore shawls. They'd sit in the kitchen around the fire and just talk about the old country. They were great for reciting poetry. There was a little niche behind our kitchen stove where my brother Ed could hide himself and listen to the old folks. And from that, he learned all kinds of Irish poems. From the top to the bottom, he could recite them. And then there were always the letters from Ireland. They'd be referred to and talked about. We used to receive what they called letters edged in black. That meant it was announcing from Ireland the death of somebody back there to the family. My father received the news of the death of his mother sometime in the 1930s, and the news came in a letter edged in black. So they knew, as soon as they saw that letter, they knew there'd been a death in the old country. I want to shift back to a couple of more moments in time and take a look at Butte during the era of the Great Depression. This is a photo of women from the Butte Junior Service League that was founded in 1931, and they started working in partnership with the East Side Neighborhood House, which was a settlement house in Butte, to provide daily milk for children in Butte. And I don't think they really saw any irony of their furs with the kids lining up with their milk, but the kids got their milk daily. When we think about the Great Depression hitting hard across the country, in Butte, between 1929 and 1933, employment dropped by 84%. Nearly 8,000 people were unemployed by 1931. By the end of 1935, there were 6,000 people who were working in some capacity through the WPA projects in Butte. A lot of Butte women went to work in the sewing rooms, cutting and sewing garments that clothed children across the state of Montana during those years. The hardship of those childhood years remained firmly fixed in people's memories. I'll just share two short stories here. John T. Shea recalls growing up in Centerville. He said, Walkerville was up above that. The WPA had the meat up there. I pulled the little red wagon, and my mother and my sister would go up there and we'd get the meat. You had no refrigerators, so you used a brine barrel. That's where the meat went. You'd reach in there, and if your hands were cut or had nicks on them, boy, it burnt. It'd sting the hell out of you. And I told my dad, boy, that's tough on your hands. And he said, that's what bare-knuckled boxers do. They stick their hands in brine. It'll toughen you up. Don't let it bother you. Vottie Stratton was 5 at the start of the Depression. She said, we lived a couple of blocks from the roundhouse, and we'd go over there at night and take a gunny sack and a little wagon to get coal. I was little. I just went along in the wagon. My mother would bundle me all up because it was so cold. We'd go over there, and if we got a sack of coal, we thought we were rich. The watchman would turn the other way when the women and children came over. They came with baby buggies and everything to get the coal. And then the watchmen, they just turned their backs and let us take it. Life for many young people in Butte, as well as around the country, changed profoundly after December 7th, 1941. World War II disrupted family life across the country as 16 million men and women joined the military. 57,000 Montana men and women served in World War II, nearly 10% of the population. Over 2,500 Butte mine workers served in the armed forces during the course of the war, and another 3,500 contributed to the war effort through their work in the mines. Butte children joined in the nationwide effort to both buy and sell war bonds. Little red wagons were put into military service as children gathered and hauled scrap metal for drives being coordinated nationwide. And the images of war permeated child's play. As Kay Antonetti recalled, she said, we used to play that we were Army nurses, and our bikes were the ambulances. We had a hospital set up in the garage, and oh my God, we'd ring the sirens and we'd go get the patients, and we'd have just a wonderful time. Wartime also created opportunities for young people to serve their country and assert their independence. John Mazzola was in high school when the U.S. entered World War II. He described like a lot of young boys in his class would just stand up in the middle of class and walk out and enlist. He was due to graduate in June of 1943, and in February of 1943, he said, I got patriotic. I thought, well, this war's going to be over. I want to help my brothers, and I want to help my country too. So I turned 17, and I went up and I enlisted. The end of the war also left indelible memories, as Kay Aunt Nettie recalls. She said, on VJ Day, everyone was out in the streets with confetti and horns honking. Horns like you got for New Year's Eve. Everybody was happy. It was just like you saw in the pictures, with everyone hugging and dancing. Another piece of the stories that resonate through so many people's memories of childhood in Butte are during times of strikes. There were particularly charged moments when union and company sympathies divided the community into powerful us and them. Children sometimes took cues from their parents or their teachers or their friends or schoolmates, trying to make sense of the tensions and divisions in the community. They also developed their own understandings, and sometimes their understandings seemed even more nuanced than what they were getting from home. John T. Shea remembered a strike in 1934 during the height of the Depression, and he said he and his friends, they'd head down to the mine yards to take on the men who were taking over their father's jobs. He said, we used to practice our pitching arms, throwing rocks at those scabs behind the fence. They'd walk to work with paper bags over their heads, but we'd run alongside to get a peek at their faces. But lots of them, you recognized them just by their shoes. Children felt the hardships and deprivation despite their parents' best efforts to keep up a good front. Betty Matisich remembered being pretty confused by the feelings that were stirred in that 1934 strike. She said, we lived right by the Stewart mine, and behind the fence, or what we found out later were what they called scabs. In my mind, they were very, very nice men. They always gave us an orange or a Hershey bar, and bars of palm olive soap once. And when my dad came home, he said, where did you get that soap, Betty? And I said, these nice men gave it to me behind that fence at the mine. So he put all the soap in the sack, and he said, now I want you to throw that back at those men. And I threw the soap, and I cried. Promises of wartime post-war prosperity were short-lived in Butte, and men came back from the war and found fewer jobs and frozen wages. There was a brief strike in 1946, but it was a violent one that really remains fixed in people's memories. It polarized the community, resulted in the destruction of several homes, mainly homes of men who were doing maintenance work, who were required to be staying inside to keep the pumps running so that once the strike was settled, the equipment would be operating again. During the time that I was doing this research, a woman by the name of Sarah Massey, who was age 5 at the time the strike happened, she's now 70, she submitted her written memoir to the archives in Butte about her memory of that strike and being in one of the homes that was destroyed. So I'm going to share just a couple of paragraphs of Sarah Massey's account. She was 5 years old from when the strike began. Her father's job required him to go behind the fence to keep the pumps operating in the mines. She says, the first time of trouble was in the middle of the night when a rock was thrown through our living room window. My sister Ruth was awakened by the sound of breaking glass. Ruth and I were sleeping in the upstairs bedroom. Mother was asleep downstairs. Mother hollered for Ruth to come downstairs and bring Sarah and not turn on any lights. I remember being awakened by sounds I didn't understand. My mother was yelling. I heard glass breaking. I heard the sound of rocks hitting the side of our house. It was very dark, and I didn't know where I was or what was happening. Ruth and I were on the floor behind the kitchen stove, covered in a blanket. We were both crying. I was 5 years old. Ruth was 14. The damage to our house was unbelievable. Because I was only 5 years old, I didn't understand why people destroyed our house. I didn't know what a strike was. I didn't know what crossing a picket line meant. The word scab had been painted on the outside of our house, and when I asked people what the word was, I was told it was a bad word and that bad people had painted it on our house. No other explanation was given to me at the time. I'm going to shift us to a more playful spot in stories of childhood and take a look at children at play in Butte. Butte kids grew up in a rough and tumble world where they claimed slag heaps and mine yards and city streets as their playgrounds. Their memories of childhood escapades are marked with both pride and chagrin as adults recall their brash acts and sort of wonder at times how they survived. Surviving winter, it seems like most all of the stories I recorded or read, it's either a flexible flyer or some kind of homemade toboggan, and there's accounts of people just going out of control down Butte's steep winter hillsides. And this little piece from the Butte Miner sort of captures it all for me. Coming at top speed and crashing into a telephone pole with a frail sled was the experience of Laureen Thurwell and Madeline McCroon of Centerville last Tuesday. Stunned and bleeding, they were picked up and carried home, where physicians were sent for. It was discovered that Miss Thurwell had suffered a broken nose and severe bruises, and her playmate, Miss McCroon, had her scalp laid open with its contact to the pole. Both girls are recovering rapidly and will be at play again soon. So. I think that speaks to some of that hardy resilience. We see kids year-round in Butte honing risk-taking skills around the workings of the mines and really incorporating those gallows frames and slag heaps and settling ponds and train tracks into their social worlds. Lucille Sheehan said, we used to play in the copper tanks. We'd play in the copper water. It was just about 3 or 4 blocks from home. We had these little milk cans, and we'd fill them, and we'd play in there. And it was all around the copper tanks. They had these piles all over of debris. They were like big troughs, so we'd go and play there. I'm 90 years old, and I'm still here, so I guess it didn't do much damage to us. This is Danette Harrington, who grew up in Dublin Gulch. And she said, up above our house and back between Anaconda Road and the Bell Diamond Mine were the copper ponds. We used to go swimming there. My mother used to get so mad because my brother, the only thing that'd be left on his jeans were these little brass pieces of buttons, and the pants just got eaten alive, and the tennis shoes too. Back then, kids wore those black canvas tennis shoes, and the eyelets would just rot right out of them. They didn't last for 3 weeks. So the dozens of gallows frames, the above-ground structures for the hoists that carried the miners deep underground towered around the city. From a child's eye view, those formidable frames were the ultimate monkey bars, and only the best and the bravest would scale them. This is from One Oral History. Kids would tie a rope at the Belmont Gallows Frame or the East Park Street Bridge, hang on to the rope and swing off the ground. The Belmont ore trestle was about 75 feet above the street level and was built in such a wondrous manner that the kids could climb up the steel support towers without any trouble at all. Most of us would never go any higher than 15 or 20 feet before we got scared and had to come down and think things over. But there were those who'd climb clear to the top, and wonder of wonders, they'd get right up on that top deck without any trouble, where they would shout down to us groundlings, so we'd know they were brave enough to make it to the top deck. Sports were a centerpiece of life, whether it was boxing matches or getting into the pig pen at Clark's Park to be able to get free kids' seats for baseball games, or it was the host of neighborhood, whether it was the pickup baseball game or the marbles game on every street corner. Stories of neighborhood teams, competitive sports, and just being outside and in play, filtered through virtually all the stories. And one special holiday for kids in Butte was Halloween, and probably celebrated in one of the less expected places, Charlie Judd's New Deal Bar. Starting in the mid-1940s, the party had become an annual event. The Judds really wanted to create a sense of community, and so for one day of year, the bar didn't serve any alcohol, and it was open to all Butte children for their very own Halloween party. Charlie Judd initiated all kinds of creative fundraising efforts, like over the course of the year, he'd set aside spaces in the baseball pool designated to the Halloween party so that the party could get $100 in funds. The budget quickly surpassed $2,000 a year and over 2,000 children in attendance. This is 1952 statistics here. 2,000 children consumed 1 ton of candy, 15 boxes of apples, 4 barrels of popcorn, and 30 pounds of cotton candy. For a few years, Charlie added fireworks to the mix until an errant rocket targeted a group of young ghosts and goblins, and Charlie had to fling himself in its path and sustained a wound to his head in the process. Stories of childhood play also have a lot of memories of being at the Saturday matinee, saving that nickel or dime to get in, and you were certainly, you were to just have one person pay admission, and then that person had the job of going and opening the back door on the alley side so that everybody else could get in to see the movie. I mean, you were sort of looked down upon if you actually paid your own way more than just that one dime for the group. Frank Carden remembered the Lyric Theater on Butte's East Side. He said on Saturdays and Sundays, they'd have what you called the Cowboy Opera. It consisted of Cowboy Pete Morse being shown riding his horse first from east to west, then from west to east to rescue the heroine. Pete never kissed or hugged the heroine, but he was often seen hugging and kissing his horse. He had a great following among the kids. And every time he kissed the horse, the kids would hoot and whistle and cheer him, just like girls of a later period did for Frank Sinatra. Closer to home, radio captivated children through the 1950s until its magic was eclipsed by television. Linda Reha, who grew up in Fintown, remembered the importance of radio in her childhood. She said, I was a great lover of the radio. I used to listen to all the stories like The Lone Ranger and Dick Tracy. I loved The Lone Ranger on the radio. The radio was so warm. I would sit in the kitchen, I'd wrap my arms around the radio and listen to the show. We had a wood stove, but we never had regular heating on the east side, so the radio was so nice and warm. While mine yards and movie halls were certainly the everyday entertainment for children, the most special place that rests in Butte childhood memories is Columbia Gardens. It was a sight and symbol of so many of the joys and memories of childhood. People get transported into memory as they detail going to the Columbia Gardens, getting a chance to ride on the trolley car to get there, getting in free, having the popcorn stand at the gate as you entered. This is Marie Butori remembering. And then there was the little fish place where the kids could fish and get little prizes. And then up on top they had the airplanes. And then they had the carousel where everybody had their favorite horse. And then they had a roller coaster. A lot of people didn't go on that roller coaster, but I always did. I thought it was great. It had 3 great big dips and it went around twice. On Thursday, it was Children's Day, and you could go and pick pansies. They had this huge spray of pansies. They'd open the gate and everybody'd go in. They used to mess up the whole place, but then it was so pretty, and they had this one section of the gardens where there was a butterfly and there was a harp. The magic of the gardens lives on in people's memories of childhood in Butte, but the handwriting was eventually on the wall with the start of open-pit mining operations. As Dolores Kangas remembered, she said, I'm sure W.A. Clark turned over in his grave when he heard that the gardens was gone. He fixed that up for families so that miners had a place to go when they got off work besides home. People aren't happy about it even today, but that's what they do. It's hard to fight big mining companies. Columbia Gardens was closed in 1973, and major part of it burned shortly thereafter. I'm going to just tell a couple of little stories from people's memories of school days in Butte. Children's stories of school, of Butte childhood are replete with a lot of special memories of childhood. They have keen impressions of teachers, a strong sense of justice, and they were often learning lessons that weren't necessarily those being taught in the classroom. A lot of children remembered English as a second language in school and described schools as sort of little leagues of nations. They described shuttling back and forth between whether it be Italian or Croatian or whatever the home language was and English in school. John Mazzola attended the Grant School, and one powerful memory that stayed with him was about that question of learning English. He said, I want to tell you about these kids from all these different countries. They spoke Finnish, Serb, Croat, Italian. They'd come to school, and the teachers had a tough time because they had to try to teach these kids to speak English. There was one little kid, wonderful little Serb kid. He was reading the paper, and he'd say, the soldiers are marching down the street, hammer, hammer. The teacher came over and hit him on the knuckles with the ruler and said, read that right. The soldiers are marching down the street. Hammer, hammer. It was hurrah, hurrah, but he couldn't pronounce hurrah. He'd never seen that word before. Steve Sharrock remembered the sort of the cultural practices that came into school, like when he grew up in McQueen, and he said, the schoolroom would just be this sort of petri dish of illness in the winter too, and so all these kids are coming with their home memories or home remedies into the school. He said they'd rub mentholatum or Vicks or just plain lard on you, and then they'd put a piece of flannel on top of that, and then thread some garlic cloves and either put them down your neck or pin it on the flannel and then send you to school. So you think of a class full of kids that way. We must have smelled terrible. Here's this mongrel bunch of kids dressed with all these home remedies, and when you got a cough, your mother mixed a little potion with it. It was 3 parts brandy, 1 part part honey and 2 parts lemon juice. She put it in a little bottle, and you'd take it to school with you. She said you always were supposed to shake it before you drink it, so you'd get a little cough, you'd shake it, you'd take a sip, the cough would settle down. We were in 3rd or 4th grade. The teachers never said anything. They just conducted the class. And I wasn't the only one carrying a little flask when I had a cold. We were all like that. The Butte I Band certainly held a special place in many people's childhood memories. It was a source of city pride, and I would argue that it was a source that brought people back together after some of the hard and painful times in Butte. They won a prized place in the 1948 Rose Bowl Parade and was the first out of the state of California band to perform. They paid for the 136-member band to go through community subscription. People made it possible for all the members to go. They performed before a crowd of 1,500,000 people along the parade route, and they were welcomed with a homecoming celebration when they came back to Butte. Even more touching for me is in some of the records I've found. The records of Henry Schieser, who was the director of the band and deeply respected man. And there were letters sent to him from young men serving in the Pacific during World War II and remembering back to days of concerts and just these touching letters that you could see the powerful connection to this sense of extended family they felt to that band and to the Schiesers and the camaraderie that was really holding their heart and souls together during the war as well. I'm going to wrap up here with just a couple of stories of children's labor, and I think that was for me one of the exciting pieces to learn about. Children were hardworking and entrepreneurial and contributing to their family's well-being in all sorts of different ways, and proud of it. Having part-time jobs and being able to be part of the family economy meant something to kids. Kevin Shannon, he writes about, remembered how he said, I used to sing. I used to know all the Irish songs. I capitalized on the Irish songs, the happy war songs and the sad love songs. I knew all those songs, and I'd go into the bars, the old Irish bars, and I'd sing those songs. And they'd see me coming, and they'd say, hey, kid, sing me a camali. You know what a camali is? Every Irish song starts with come all ye. So they called them camalis. And you'd sing them, and they'd pay you. Maybe a quarter, maybe more. I don't know, I was 9, 10 years old. I have a terrific memory for the old Irish songs. My dad collected records. He had some records you couldn't believe. The old rebel songs, John McCormick, all of those. I was raised around all the Irish from all the counties. I knew what the Donegal people liked to hear. I knew what the Corkonians liked to hear. I knew what the Clare people liked to hear. And I knew these places. If you were from Donegal, you went to Boyle's Bar. Oh, they loved dear old Donegal. Yeah, I can remember exactly the first time I went into a bar and sang. It was Con Bonner's bar, and Honey McDivitt was playing the fuddle. He always called it a fuddle. He was playing The Rising of the Moon, and I started singing it. I was making $4 a day through my singing and my paper route. It all went to my mother. I think she knew how I was making money, and she didn't say anything. She didn't want me in the joints. Then when I was 15, I went to work as a railroad man. I'd been making $4 a day before, and I went to work for $3.76. Skeff Sheehy began his career in newspaper sales at the age of 8 as well. His earnings went to help support the family. He says, whatever I made, I turned everything over to my mother, 25 or 30 cents.